All right, welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. Obviously, we live in very interesting times. We just had a national election. We've elected a new president, and the president right now is going through the very important process of transitioning. We don't really talk about that very much, in American government, but certainly if you took a class in the presidency, you would understand that actually even before, about the time that a president secures their party's nomination, or if you're the incumbent president, you've locked up the nomination. You go through a transition process. The reality is that that point where we're moving from one president to the next can be a point of considerable vulnerability, and so we actually have laws, the Presidential Transition Act among them, that really are supposed to make it easier for presidents to be able to hit the ground running and get their team in place as quickly as possible. In the last class, we talked about recess appointments. And actually this past Sunday, on I believe November 10th, incoming President Donald Trump took to his social media platform, Truth Social, and said, I want the Senate to allow me to make recess appointments on my team. Now, that is an extraordinary demand because in order for a president to make a recess appointment, both houses of Congress have to be out of session for at least 10 days. And so, this has been a point of controversy in the past, usually with senators attempting to insist basically that presidents had to go through a confirmation process when they were making appointments. Typically in instances of divided government, you often find situations where the Senate will simply no, we don't want to appoint certain people. This happened certainly under the Obama administration, where Congress had created called the National Labor Relations Board. And the Senate Republicans who control it at the time simply weren't holding hearings or confirmation hearings on Barack Obama's appointees. And so Obama basically said, you guys are not really in session, you're just in pro forma session. So he basically made recess appointments to fill those positions. That case went to the Supreme Court. And I think the case was NLRB v. Noel Canning, 2014. The year was 2014. The court basically unanimously held, with a liberal justice, Stephen Breyer, saying that the Senate sets their own rules and the Senate is in session when they say they're in session. So it doesn't matter whether it's a dodge to keep the president from doing the things that they want to do in terms of the appointment power. What Trump is doing is unique in that he is basically telling Republicans who will control the Senate when they come into power in the third week of January, I want you to go out of session. As if Congress does not have important business to do, and he's also kind of holding it contingent in terms of his support for who's going to be the next majority leader. In fact, we have the previous majority leader for Republicans, Mitch McConnell, has basically said he is going to retire at the end of his term in 2026 and has decided to step down as majority leader. So there is actually a race between, I believe, South Dakota's, or it's either South Dakota or North Dakota, John Thune, and I want to say Texas's John Cornyn, and Florida's Rick Scott as to who will be Republicans' next majority leader. And they've all said, yeah, we'll let this happen. Now, Article 2, Section 3 clearly requires that the president's appointment power be balanced by the Senate's advice and consent. What is it going to say if both houses of Congress decide to gavel out for 10 days at the start of a legislative term at the demand of the other executive, the leader of the other co-equal branch of government? It's concerning to me. It leads one to suggest that Donald Trump intends to appoint people that likely couldn't even get a majority of Republicans to support him. And remember, Republicans are going to have, I believe, a 53 to 47 advantage in the Senate. They should be able to get Donald Trump's team in place as quickly as Donald Trump wants to, even going through the Senate confirmation process. The problem is ultimately going to be if Trump goes in and appoints people that are really controversial, who do really controversial things, the Senate is going to be partially accountable for, those problems, because they will not have done their constitutional duty to show due diligence and to say to Donald Trump that you may have appointed some people who are not qualified. And it's important to keep in mind that 7 of Donald Trump's original appointees in his first term were forced to resign early in his term, either through due to malfeasance or allegations of corruption. So, it's not like this guy has a track record that should inspire a great deal of confidence. So what are we going to learn today? As I noted, our discussion last week with the presidency deals a lot with the executive branch, broadly speaking. We want to talk about the bureaucracy as a standalone phenomenon because it is a standalone phenomenon, at least for now, to some extent. I'll talk more about the challenges confronting people serving in the federal bureaucracy under Donald Trump in the next presentation. But it's important to keep in mind that the federal bureaucracies are effectively the muscles of government. Okay, all the things that the constitutional branches of government do are basically the things that are empowering the federal bureaucracy to act. So the federal government, presidents issue executive orders, Congress pass laws, Supreme Court justices issue rulings. Ultimately, it's the federal bureaucracy that does those things, and the federal bureaucracy works best when all 3 of the constitutional branches of government are actually governing collaboratively and in good faith. The federal bureaucracy is placed in often untenable positions when the 3 branches of government are at loggerheads and can't come to a consensus on how to act. So what are we learning today? Well, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about what the federal bureaucracy actually is. And then secondly, we're going to move on and talk about who are bureaucrats. Many Americans have an image of a federal civil servant as being some kind of officious, paper, wielding, condescending person. The reality is that many people in the federal bureaucracy are scientists, are very important researchers whose job it is to figure out how is the weather changing, how is that how can we better avoid terrible weather events that cause loss of life. How can we better research agricultural products to ensure that people are getting access to safe and healthy food? How do we ensure mine safety to the extent that mining is still an activity that hundreds of thousands of Americans still engage in? How can we ensure that mines are safe for people to work in? So these are some of the things that bureaucrats, that these are some of the jobs that they do. So what exactly is the federal bureaucracy? And again, it's important to keep in mind, the Constitution is absolutely silent on the idea of a federal bureaucracy, okay? But in fact, there is a constitutional authorization within Article 2 that basically says the president shall appoint such people, and that, again, with the advice and consent of the Senate, okay? So bureaucracy, like many things in politics, is a compound terms. It's, kratine, which is, the latter part of the word bureaucracy, which means rule by. Bureau is French for desk. So when you think about it, bureaucracy literally means rule by desks. Okay, and so if you look at most textbooks dealing with bureaucracy, they'll offer a kind of definition that will say bureaucracy consists of the complex systems of office tasks, rules, and principles of organization employed by all large-scale institutions to coordinate the work of their personnel. In other words, they are doing the work of government. At their best, bureaucracy ensures equitable and accountable public administration of the laws. Now, it's important to keep in mind, what does it mean by when you say public administration? From the origins of public administration in the late 19th century, it basically referred to the idea that implementing the laws, implementing the politics of a government is a politically neutral task that is separate from politics. Okay, Woodrow Wilson was one of the first political scientists, and he basically carved out, in a famous article, what is what is administration? He basically carved that out and said that the best way for politics to be enacted into law is to basically put it in the hands of impersonal experts who don't have an axe to grind in terms of the politics. Okay, so bureaucracy is virtually invisible when it's running efficiently. When it is efficiently doing the work of government, the only thing that makes it controversial is whether the policy is working or not, and whether the policy is harming people or not. Okay, but bureaucracy can become spectacularly visible when bureaucracy breaks down, when there are things, like what happened with the Veterans Affairs, the hospital system during the Obama administration. In no small part, that was a function of the political branches of government not anticipating that running millions of Americans through Afghanistan and Iraq in multiple tours of duty was going to create enormous health demands on the veterans' healthcare system. Okay, think of it I'll use a football metaphor real quick. Bureaucracy is kind of like the left tackle of the government. Right? When the left tackle is doing their job well, when they can handle the other team's best pass rusher, then they're virtually anonymous. But when the other guy's quarterback gets 3 or 4 sacks in a game and disrupts the offense, then that left tackle their deficiencies suddenly become really clear. A good example of bureaucracy breaking down was Hurricane Katrina. This was a Category 5 event that made landfall between Gulfport, Mississippi, and New Orleans, Louisiana, in 2005. And the problem it was actually multiple bureaucracies. Okay, on the one hand, it was a long-term problem with the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for the levee system that keeps New Orleans dry. Okay, New Orleans actually is below sea level, and there are a series of levees, otherwise known as dikes, that basically keep water from impeding. There was also the fact that there were huge amounts of fen land, which is basically swampy areas that have huge amounts of sand that were actually in front of New Orleans that did a good job of absorbing the enormous mass of water that a hurricane is going to bring on shore. It's important to keep in mind, it's not just the water falling out of the sky that creates a problem. If you've ever been in a pool and you've swept your arm along the water, part of the problem is that it's water that's getting displaced by these enormous wind gusts that are coming in bands that are pushing ashore. And it's kind of like somebody that's twirling at a really rapid speed with their arms outside. And it's sweeping waves of water. This is called storm surge. And the problem is that all that fen land that had been in front of New Orleans for centuries had been eroded by oil exploration. They had gone in, they drilled, they cleared a lot of that area. And so there was a lot less sand to absorb all that water that was that was pushing on shore. And so the Army Corps of Engineers, first and foremost, They didn't do a good enough job of understanding the physics of what a huge storm surge would do. And the dikes, the levees were undercut underneath the water. Huge water currents were pushed against the dikes that caused several of the dikes to collapse, and that it effectively flooded the city of New Orleans. That was a failing of one bureaucratic agency. Then you also had the emergency response, okay? The Federal Emergency Management Administration, FEMA, was responsible for managing, again, the problem here is, you've got city people, the municipal government, law enforcement supposed to try and keep order. The state of New Orleans, or the state of Louisiana is supposed to, bring emergency personnel in. But the problem is when you get that kind of an event, it drives those people, it basically overwhelms those folks. And so the federal government's job is to declare an emergency and step in. And the Federal Emergency Management Administration simply failed to adequately coordinate the response. And part of the reason was that in 2003, FEMA, which had been an independent agency, had been folded into the Department of Homeland Security. And so the Department of Homeland Security's priority in the years immediately after the 9/11 attacks, the 9/11 2001 terrorist attacks, was terrorism. So emergency management was not at the top of the Bush administration's radar, okay? And so they simply did not have the adequate resources to get into the Louisiana and Mississippi areas. You also have the frank reality. George W. Bush, the president at the time, put a political loyalist in charge of FEMA. He put his former chief of staff when he was governor of Texas, a guy named Joe Albaugh, in place. That guy left to become a lobbyist, and in his place was another kind of loyalist of George W. Bush named Mike Brown. Mike Brown was a lawyer who actually has Oklahoma ties. Both Joe Albaugh and Mike Brown had been in Oklahoma for periods of time. Mike Brown had been the head of the Arabian Horse Administration, the kind of an interest group for Arabian horses, which did not put him it didn't give him a knowledge base to manage that particular crisis. Okay? And so they bungled the response, and people suffered and died as a result. And that was one of the things that really damaged the Bush administration's final 2 years in office, that their response to Katrina was widely judged as a miserable failure. Another good example, again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, was the Department of Veterans Affairs. I often see on social media, we shouldn't be forgiving student loans, we should be doing more, or we shouldn't have an LGBTQ day, or any other day. Why don't we have a day dedicated to veterans? Well, in fact, we have a cabinet-level department dedicated to veterans. We have an entire system of hospitals dedicated to veterans. We have the GI Bill, which is dedicated to veterans. There are lots of, veterans are not typically a constituency group that you would look at and say, these people are not well served, okay? Nevertheless, the occupations, the working of the war on terror from 2002, really, well into the 2000s. Again, we just got out of Afghanistan in 2022. The fact that we have had so many, National Guardsmen who were activated and put into combat. The fact that we had so many regular military folks that served so many tours in combat and suffered many traumatic brain injuries as a result of IEDs and everything else. That created a real challenge, okay? Now, veterans, again, have always, again, in the aftermath of the Civil War, we did tons of things for Civil War veterans. That has always been, we do have Veterans Day. which I think is mostly symbolic. But nevertheless, we just had Veterans Day. It's a very important event to acknowledge the people who have engaged in that ultimate sacrifice of submitting themselves to military training and of risking their lives on behalf of the country. We all deserve, we all have a debt of gratitude to pay to those folks. The Veterans Administration was initially established in 1930. There had been previously kind of standalone different agencies that dealt with veterans. In 1989, the Department of Veterans Affairs was elevated to a cabinet-level department. And again, this includes a standalone hospital system that is supposed to be dedicated to veterans. Now, again, I think if anyone had been paying attention on a policy basis to the number of people who were in the military, who had been in combat, who had been rotated through, and as National Guardsmen and everything else, they would have said, we're going to have a surge of people that are going to need additional health care. And not just kind of physical health care, but also mental health care. And then you've also, again, you're dealing with an aging, Vietnam War population, an aging, Persian Gulf War population. You've still got some Korean War vets, and so again, it's actuarially predictable that as people age, they're going to need more access to health care, and yet we didn't expand our health care system. As a result of that reality. We were in the midst of a period where everyone was saying we need to reduce the size and scope of the federal government. And the result was there were kind of multi-administration challenges that frankly were not dealt with well. And that again produced an enormous series of scandals related to veterans not getting access to the health care that they deserve. And again, I think both parties deserve a significant amount of criticism for how they manage things. So what do bureaucrats do? First and foremost, bureaucrats execute and implement laws. In other words, bureaucrats determine who is eligible for Medicare. They engage in scientific research to determine whether a new drug is safe and effective. They're also known as civil servants. They deliver mail. They tell campers at national parks where they can build a campfire. Some bureaucrats are physicists at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Their job is to calculate how long it would take a spacecraft to reach to the edge of the solar system, or what would it take to be able to actually have a colony on the moon? These are questions that people are asking, right? Bureaucratic implementation is a process, right? Implementation, again, refers to the efforts of departments and agencies to translate a specific bureaucratic set of rules and policies into actions, okay? Congressional legislation establishes the broad parameters of government action. Controversies have arisen in recent years over the idea of administrative discretion and which lead to, again, another manifestation of what we call the principal agent problem. An illustration of administrative discretion is the Biden administration's Department of Education attempting to forgive student loans that were canceled for eligible students. The Biden administration based its plan on the 2003 HEROES Act, which granted to the Secretary of Education the authority to modify or waive the regulatory requirements of the student loan program. Republican attorneys generals from 6 states challenged the forgiveness program, arguing that the Secretary of Education lacked the authority to make such sweeping cancellations of debt. In a 6-3 majority decision, the Supreme Court ruled in Biden versus Nebraska in 2023 that they basically invoked what was known as the major questions doctrine to conclude that significant cancellation of debt required congressional authorization. Biden publicly disagreed with the ruling, and the minority justices accused the majority of inventing a legal doctrine to serve the majority's ideological preferences. Biden has continued to forgive student loans by other means. And why has he done that? Largely, I think his argument is that many low-income Americans are trapped by student loan debt. They were sucked in by public for-profit universities and put in a situation where they took on a lot of debt and didn't ultimately get a degree because for many for-profit universities, the aim is not to get degrees for students, but rather to grab as much student loan money as they can. So another important aspect of bureaucracy is that they make rules. Rule-making is one of the most important activities for bureaucratic agencies. Okay? Rule-making involves the detailed and specific instructions for operationalizing broad congressional intent. Keep in mind, members of Congress, to the extent that they are often experts in the legislative process, not in the regulatory process or into any other aspect of implementing public policy. So an example of this is Congress. In 1963, they passed the Clear Air Act, which authorized what would become the Environmental Protection Agency. It authorized a federal agency to implement pollution controls. Okay? The EPA's job is to determine what level of pollutants is acceptable for an industry to release into the air. And again, when Democrats have been in power, they have generally said we want fewer pollutants. When Republicans have been in power, they have generally said we're okay with a bit more pollutants. The same thing with auto, emissions policies or the miles per gallon regulations. The federal regulatory agencies under Democrats will generally say, we want, the American automakers to be producing more cars that get further, more miles to the gallon by some set date. Typically, Republicans are less tight about those kinds of things. So the rulemaking process is actually fairly laborious. The first thing that has to happen is Congress passes the law, in this instance for the EPA to reduce air pollution. The second step is that the relevant agencies study the legislation and propose a set of rules to guide the implementation. Those proposed rules are then submitted to the Office of Management and Budget and to a subset, the OIRA, for review. Those proposed rules are subsequently published in the Federal Register for a public notice and comment period. After public notice and any resulting change, the rules go back to the OMB for clearance and final publication in the Federal Register, which again is this massive compendium of all the rules and regulations that exist. Once promulgated, the rules have the force of law. You can be arrested for violating an EPA regulation. Rollback is another thing. Again, while rules have the force of law, they're easier to change than congressional legislation. Congress can legislate to change rules. Rules made by one administration are often easily reversed by the next. And for an example, the Obama administration imposed new emission standards for cars, but the Trump administration rolled them back, and then Biden went back. Trump will undoubtedly reverse what Biden had reversed. This is sort of a, kind of a ping pong effect. Bureaucrats also enforce laws. Bureaucratic agencies exercise considerable discretion over private actors and industries. Another example, the Environmental Protection Agency caught a foreign manufacturer, Volkswagen, selling cars in the United States that had installed software that showed on their computers legal emissions in testing, but were actually 10 to 40% higher. Now this demonstrates intent. Volkswagen understood that their diesel vehicles could not be, they could not meet American emission standards. Rather than pull those vehicles and work to make them, compliant, they installed software to make it look like they were compliant. Now that is a major no-no. Volkswagen was forced to admit it had cheated. They agreed to pay $14.7 billion in settlement to buy back faulty vehicles and to compensate owners, as well as funding several cleanup programs in the United States. So, I mean, that is a serious cost. $14.7 billion is a lot of money, even for a major automobile manufacturer like Volkswagen. Bureaucrats also innovate. One of the great examples of a bureaucratic innovation, and it's important to keep in mind, a lot of Americans look at government and say they're sclerotic. I don't know if you know what that means. Sclerosis is like where you get clogged arteries. They're slow to act. They're unimaginative. Not the place where you would look for innovation. Nevertheless, we have gotten enormous amounts of innovation out of the federal government. For example, the internet basically was a result of the Department of Defense exploring the feasibility of creating a means of communication that would be resistant to electromagnetic pulse detonations. That was one of the things that we all understood fairly early in the Cold War, that if someone were to detonate an electromagnetic pulse device over the United States, it would basically knock out all telephone communications. Okay? So the Defense Department began creating or looking into the feasibility of what was known as ARPANET following the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik in 1957. By 1970, roughly 20 research universities were connected to ARPANET. Ultimately, of course, it was government action that facilitated this. Al Gore was widely derided during the 2000 presidential campaign for saying he invented the internet. He didn't do that. He obviously wasn't involved in the scientific breakthroughs that led to the creation of the internet. But he did, as a member of Congress, advocate allowing the internet to be made private, okay, to become a platform for commercial use. And in that sense, government produced government produced the thing that Elon Musk is now spent $40-something billion to purchase in terms of Twitter and other things. So another good example of government innovation. The Washington Post has recently been running a Who is Government series, and one of the first stories was about a guy who his dad was an engineer, a famous engineer, who developed a way of studying the ancient the medieval cathedrals to figure out how they could maintain their structural integrity over centuries. This guy ended up becoming a coal miner, and then he worked in coal mines for years, and then he decided he was really interested in the science of coal mining, in measuring structural weights, the engineering dynamics of coal mines. He actually developed safety features in mines that have dramatically reduced mine collapses, okay, because he understood that there are certain structural stresses that exist on mines, and that the basic way of coal, especially like coal mining, simply are set up to produce mine collapses. And so this guy developed safety features that have dramatically reduced the numbers of death from mine collapses and from methane explosions and things like that. That's a guy that, again, he just wanted to mine for a while, and then he got interested in the issue. And that's really where you get a lot of innovation. Okay, it's important to keep in mind there was a scientist that Michael Lewis, who's a guy that he's written a lot of great books. One of the books he wrote was called The Fifth Risk, and in that book he talks about a female scientist who conducted studies that really demonstrated that lots of Latino children were lactose intolerant, and that feeding them milk at school lunch programs was maybe not the best idea. So what are some of the key characteristics of bureaucracies? All bureaucratic agencies are guided by a mission statement that is basically embedded in the legislation that creates them. Okay? It sets up their role. It says, here's what you're supposed to do. Here are your responsibilities. Bureaucratic agencies are staffed by a wide array of experts that perform oftentimes very highly technical tasks. Bureaucracies are also characterized by hierarchical structures, okay, with a clear chain of command. In the United States, bureaucracy has typically been insulated from politics. We'll talk about whether that's going to continue going forward. You also have, again, attempts to make bureaucratic agencies and bureaucratic personnel as apolitical as possible. One of the keys to that is a piece of legislation known as the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act was passed in 1939. Now, this was right in the midst of a major U.S., again, first and foremost, you had the Great Depression, which had led to the New Deal. Dramatic expansion in the size of the federal government, okay? And you were in the midst of us beginning the process of getting ready for World War II. The Roosevelt administration was convinced that we would be drawn into the war sooner or later. They had, basically persuaded, Republicans to begin investing heavily in our military infrastructure. And so, basically, that led to concerns about the politicization of such a, again, we were witnessing the rise of the administrative state. And so Congress passed the Hatch Act basically to say to people, you cannot be involved in overt politicking if you are a member of the federal bureaucracy. Okay. Now, in 1993, they kind of liberalized that a little bit. They said, you're not sacrificing all your political rights. You can still contribute to campaigns. You can still vote. Okay. But nevertheless, the expectation was that when people came into government, particularly into the federal bureaucracy, that they would not be partisan about it. Okay. That has again become, as we have become more partisan, more polarized on a partisan line, that has oftentimes created enormous stresses, and people have violated the Hatch Act. And here is one of the big challenges. There really aren't any penalties. Okay, particularly again, if it's, for example, during the first Trump administration, Kellyanne Conway, who was one of his, White House advisors, violated the Hatch Act multiple times. The problem is that the Hatch Act, in order to be enforced, you actually have to have a criminal referral, and there are no really set criminal penalties. The law is effectively toothless. It's more of a finger wag than anything that carries real consequences. And so members of both political parties have gotten caught up in accusations that they were violating the Hatch Act. And unfortunately, what that has tended to do is feed the impression that federal civil servants are partisans rather than kind of disinterested civil servants. So why does Congress delegate such significant policy-making authority to the bureaucracy? First and foremost, again, decisions over policy implementation involve specialized judgments by experts. And Congress, they can call experts in, and they do, and they try to make legislation that gives experts guidance. But at the same time, the basic fact is bureaucracy works best when it has a certain amount of freedom to respond and to improvise to events as they are dealing with an implementation, with implementing a policy. So that contributes to the Congress authorizes and bureaucrats implement nature of the principal agent problem. And the Supreme Court has thrown a kind of a monkey wrench into that relationship with its major cases doctrine. They actually recently seriously eroded what had previously been known as Chevron deference, which was a Supreme Court case dealing with Chevron Corporation, where again the Supreme Court held that Congress should, that the political branches and the courts should extend deference to regulating agencies, assuming that they know what their job is to do. The major cases doctrine seriously erodes that sense of administrative discretion. And so you're going to find yourself, and likely we will find ourselves pretty quickly in the next coming year or so, in situations where the bureaucracy where bureaucratic agencies feel like they can't act without direct guidance from Congress. That is going to slow down a lot of implementation decisions. That's going to make governing a lot more difficult. Now, a lot of conservatives say, hey, less government, that's great. Well, you're going to find lots and lots of instances where that's not so great, where that's going to create real serious challenges that are going to be hard to overcome. So how is bureaucracy organized? When we talk about the administrative state, it is comprised of a wide variety of different bureaucratic agencies dedicated to a variety of tasks. Okay, at the largest level, at the broadest level, are the 15 cabinet departments. These are the largest bureaucratic entities with the broadest missions. The first 4 cabinets were created under Washington, and they originally were the Departments of State, Treasury, War, and Justice. The remaining departments, and again, the Department of War, there was also a separate Department of the Navy. They were eventually combined under the Department of Defense. And so the remaining departments were added over time, including the Department of the Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and most recently, the Department of Homeland Security. Okay? Cabinet departments employ over 80% of the civilian workforce. And again, that's not including the 1.2 million people who are serving in the military. You also have the Executive Office of the Presidents, the EOP agencies. They employ many of the remaining federal workers. So when you look at the size of the federal government and you say, oh God, it's so huge, you also have to remember we are a continent-sized country with over 340 million people living in there. Okay, so the most important EOP, the Executive Office of the President agencies, are the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, the National Security Council, which is the NSC, and the Council of Economic Advisors. There are a number of other agencies in the Executive Office of the President that are, quite consequential. There are also some independent executive agencies that are independent for either practical or symbolic reasons. For example, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the NASA, was created independently of the Defense Department because the U.S. didn't want to be viewed in the midst of the Cold War as militarizing space. Okay. Likewise, the Central Intelligence Agency was created under the National Defense Act of 1947, and it was created as an independent agency, independent of the Department of Defense, which was also reorganized by that same law, the National Security Act. Basically, again, because they didn't want the perception that the CIA was going to be operating like a secret police force, like the Gestapo was in Nazi Germany. So that really kind of reflects, or the KGB, in the Soviet Union. We didn't want a secret police force, and in fact, we can tell you, I can tell you, as someone that studied authoritarian governments, that one of the key components of every authoritarian government is a secret police force. And so that's one of the reasons why the CIA is legally forbidden from operating within the United States. That is considered a major no-no, and we will see if that's still the case going forward. You also have another important category of executive branch agency, and those are the independent regulatory commissions. They exist outside the formal authority of the executive branch. The stated point of that was to prevent politicization, right? So some of the major ones, the Federal Trade Commission enforces antitrust law and protects consumers. the National Consumer, whatever it is, board that was created under Obama, or actually it was created during the Bush administration. Well, no, it was created under Obama, I think. Its intent is to protect consumers specifically from practices by private industries that harm consumers. Likewise, the Federal Communications Commission regulates the electronic spectrum for commercial use. In practical terms, you could argue that the creation of the RCA and then the Federal Communications Commission is proof positive that the federal government wanted the television and radio to be able to be run for profit. Okay? That's a big part of what they do in terms of regulating access to the spectrum. Another important group of regulatory agencies are the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. That's basically a bunch of people who are economists and who are lawyers. And the job of the economists is to identify when there is evidence within the market, within the stock market, that someone is manipulating the stock market. And at that point, a decision is made to investigate that person and perhaps prosecute them. Martha Stewart was basically, ultimately prosecuted because she had engaged in stock manipulation. She had taken insider tips from a pharmaceutical industry head that she happened to know. You've also got, finally, government corporations. These are agencies that perform desirable, market-oriented public services that basically run those services on at least a nonprofit, but oftentimes for a profit. And that revenue is designed to fund that agency's activities. Why does the federal government have government corporations running for them? Because oftentimes they really have enormous incentives to see certain kind of economic activity take place, but there is not sufficient investment interest from private companies and private financiers to do that. Okay? Perhaps the most important government corporation, the U.S. Postal Service, began as a cabinet department. Ultimately, it was turned into a government corporation during the Nixon years. Another good example of a government corporation was the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was among the first speculative government corporations that was responsible for bringing electricity to the Deep South during the Great Depression. And again, think about conditions in the Great South, when in the summertime when it's 110 degrees and 80% of people don't have electricity. Only people living in the larger cities had electricity, and the South was a very rural area in the 1930s. Think about, how, if you were elderly and had any kind of cardiopulmonary issue and you're suffering through 110 degree heat. Think about infant mortality in those kinds of conditions. So the Tennessee Valley Authority was a huge investment in the South to try and bring the South into the 20th century. Even in the 1930s, the South was economically a developing, region due to the devastations from the Civil War. So America side by side, when you look at overall government employment, it's really fascinating when you look at this slide, right? First of all, think about it. 31% of people in Norway are working for the government. What does that tell you? 31%. First of all, it tells you that the oil and gas industry is basically a government corporation for Norway. Okay? Canada also has about 20%, and that tells you something as well. When you look at the United States, where are we? 15% of overall, employment is government oriented. Now, when you look at it by level of government, Turkey has the largest national public. It's a unitary government. There's very little, for the most part. Likewise, when you look at Norway, 64% are working for subnational units. That tells you that the oil and gas industry is working subnationally. Look at the United States. 81% of government employment is at the state and local level. I think I mentioned this in my earlier presentation on state and local government. Local governments alone spend over $1 trillion a year. Okay? And again, they're doing enormously important things like ensuring that your electricity grid is adequate. Because again, remember, if you're building lots of homes in an area and you don't have adequate electricity, you're going to see brownouts because you're adding to the demands on the grid and you're not adding to the grid, not adding to the robustness of the grid. Another important aspect of the federal bureaucracy is what we call the foreign policy establishment. These are the constellation of cabinet departments, independent and EOP agencies that work to basically protect national security and advance national interests. The Department of Defense is responsible for countering military threats. Now that is, that is not as simple as it sounds, right? The military has the job to protect the territorial integrity of the United States. They also have an enormous responsibility for recognizing potential threats in the future. We're oftentimes seeing, the United States has historically been had an enormous advantage. We have been investing in military, defense, apparatus and military weapons systems, spending, billions of dollars to produce ATACMS weapons systems and all these really sophisticated weapons systems. What we're finding increasingly is that uncrewed systems, cluster systems of uncrewed drones can overwhelm our very expensive weapon systems. They can raise the costs of deploying those anti-missile defenses at a very cheap cost. Right? The average drone may cost, that's being weaponized may cost as little as $10,000. Right? That is what we might call a non-attritable device. You can't kill enough of them in a cost-effective way. The military has to be aware of these changes in military doctrine, because if we find ourselves fighting a war in the near future, those folks on the other side are figuring out ways to get past the fact that we have a huge technological advantage. And so oftentimes, low-tech attacks are an enormous advantage. The Department of State, in contrast, deals with diplomacy. And again, diplomacy is what? Diplomacy is talking. Diplomacy is trying to persuade other countries or to find deals with other countries that will enable us to avoid conflict in the future. The intelligence community, and again, there's a constellation. You have the Central Intelligence Agency. You also have the National Security Agency. You have the National Geospatial Agency. You've got, the National Reconnaissance Agency. You've got the Defense Intelligence Agency. The State Department has an intelligence agency within it. All of these agencies, I can't remember how many there are. I think there might be as many as 16. Form what is known as the intelligence community. 3/4 of the intelligence community exists within the Defense Department. Okay? What is it the intelligence community does? Their job is to be sneaky and to spy on people and to eavesdrop on their communications and to give our American foreign policy makers what is known as a decision advantage, where we know things that our nation's rivals and even our allies don't know. Okay? You also have some departments like the Treasury that have both domestic and foreign policy roles. Obviously, the Department of Treasury is to manage the nation's currency, right? But it's also got a role to play in influencing international financial systems. Right? When we issue financial sanctions against a country or against a billionaire oligarch in Russia, that is the Treasury Department effectively giving instructions to other nations' financial systems: do not do business with that person. That is an enormously powerful tool. It is a tool that some economists believe that America uses too often. Okay? So if you look at the broad overview of the executive branch, this is it, right? Those big blue boxes are the big agencies, and then you've got the selected independent administrations, commissions, and government corporations, and then you've got all this other stuff. I mean, it is an enormous apparatus, and it's understandable why a lot of people call it the administrative state. But really, what it is what makes government work. And a lot of times, when you hear people sneer about the administrative state, what they're really hiding from you is the extent to which they are serving a nihilistic cause. They simply want to destroy government for the sake of destroying government. And if you think that we don't need government, as the one Philadelphia DA said during the election, mess around and find out. If you allow people in government to basically cannibalize wide, agencies in the service, getting rid, for example, the Department of Education, don't be surprised if, as a low-income American, you find it's a lot more difficult to get a college education. Because one of the main things that the Department of Education does is manage the distribution of federal loan programs. Another very important agency is, again, the Department of Homeland Security. Its origins were in the terrorist attacks of 9/11/2001. A lot of people look at the Department of Homeland Security as ironically, as sort of an example of we often talk about a camel as a horse designed by committee. This is sort of what DHS is. DHS is a vast array of formerly, oftentimes independent agencies that have been folded into one agency whose job is to protect the homeland. At least potentially, DHS has enormous influence over even local law enforcement. Okay. Now, it's important to keep in mind there are certain agencies that are not part of DHS. Obviously, the CIA, it is outside the framework of DHS. The FBI, likewise, exists under the Department of Justice. But there are many, many other, FEMA, as I mentioned earlier. The Coast Guard is now a member of DHS rather than the Defense Department. The ICE, the Immigration and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement is now. The Border Patrol are now members of DHS. So there, again, that is the challenge here is that DHS's job is to protect the homeland, which is an enormously vast mission statement. And there are enormous numbers of different agencies that help fulfill that mission. But the reality is that depending on the administration, you're going to see different mission statements enforced and prioritized over others. Ask yourself, what do you think Donald Trump is going to do? He's just appointed South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem to be Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, let's be clear, she's a governor. She's popular in her very, very low population state. She's served as a governor. She has some executive experience, but this is a person that does not even have a college degree. And now she is going to be a cabinet secretary over an enormously powerful agency. What do you think Donald Trump wants to do with DHS? He wants to deport 1 million people a year. He wants to deport undocumented immigrants. Now, again, I hold no brief for people who come to this country and break the law. But we do need, one of the reasons why our economy has largely been better than, our economic performance has been better than most other countries with advanced economies is because of the influx of undocumented people living in this country and working in this country. 1/5 of the workforce in the construction industry are undocumented. Even larger subsectors of construction. Try and get a new roof Okay, if all the undocumented labor is just pulled out of the country, or alternatively, either self-deports or goes to ground and hides. Try and get a new roof for your house in the next couple of years. The agricultural sector is heavily populated with undocumented workers who work cheaper than Americans. Again, if you pull those folks out of the workforce and then try to hire people to do the work, you're going to be paying a lot more in terms of the labor costs. Do you think that the agricultural industry, the people that sell their products, are not going to pass along those costs to Americans? If you think eggs are expensive now, let's find out. I guess we're going to find out. Another important agency is the General Accounting Office. That's, again, they consistently have issued recommendations for improving DHS management. And again, the challenge here has always been coordination. Okay, because you have, again, previously independent agencies. Many of them have different computer networking systems. Many of them have different hardware. It's very difficult to work across these kind of smaller agencies. And so DHS secretaries have oftentimes struggled to kind of get on the same page, okay? An important aspect of the federal bureaucracy are those agencies that are designed to strengthen the economy. The Treasury Department plays an essential role in collecting taxes, in printing currency. They manage the national debt. They perform economic analyses. Perhaps the single most disliked federal agency is in the Department of Treasury, and that is the Internal Revenue Service. That is part of the Treasury. They ensure that taxes are effectively and efficiently collected. Now, no one likes to pay taxes, okay? But try living in those countries where, for example, like Greece, where tax evasion is a way of life. Okay? If you don't pay your taxes, you don't get government. If you don't get government, a lot of bad things happen. Okay? That is simply a reality. All these conservatives that were screaming about the Biden administration adding 80,000 IRS agents. So it was like there were armed IRS agents running around, forcibly killing people and expropriating their money. No, again, the IRS has been starved for funds. The IRS's computer system is, decades out of date. They need to be updated. There needs to be an investment, again, so that the IRS can do its job. If you don't believe in the mission of government, then I guess we don't need the IRS. But you have to be careful what you ask for, okay? If you could wish the IRS out of existence, imagine what life would be like. How would government fund itself? And if you think government does nothing good, it's because you're not paying attention. You also have another really important agency called the Federal Reserve. This is also known as the Fed. This was created in 1913. It is the nation's what we call central banker. Now, central banking institutions exist in all advanced economies, because the one thing that we have discovered is that simply printing money and circulating it is not prudent, okay? You actually have to be aware of how much money is in the economy, because otherwise you run the risk of encountering what is known as hyperinflation, where money is essentially valueless. Okay, when you see hyperinflation in Weimar Germany prior to the Nazis taking over, that is the danger that you can have when you have hyperinflation. So, as a central banker, the Federal Reserve Board is essentially a mix of public and private institutions, okay? You actually have what are known as Federal Reserve banks that exist in different regions of the country. Their job is to manage the money supply. They are the principal mechanism for what is known as monetary policy. The job, the responsibility of monetary policy is to ensure there is neither too much money in the economy or too little, okay? And the way they do that is by adjusting the interest rates that the regional banks extend
the credit line, if you will, extend to commercial banks. Okay, so when they raise interest rates, what do you think they're doing? The Fed has actually been in a process of raising interest rates over the last couple of quarters. What are they doing? They are actually making it more expensive to buy stuff. And that actually has the effect of slowing down the economy and reducing modestly the money supply in the economy. Now, what happens when the economy goes into recession? When there is actually, you have a period of inflation where there's too much money chasing too few goods, and that causes unemployment and a contraction of the economy. What are they going to do? They're going to lower interest rates and make more money come into the economy. They make it cheaper for people to buy a car or buy a home or something like that. So ironically, one of the things that got Biden in trouble was the high price of buying a home. And part of that had to do with just basic problems with getting access to materials. But also we had, as again, a result of what happened over a 4-year period with COVID, you had a dearth of new home building, okay? And so you had supply chain issues that made lumber expensive. Then you had, again, not many people buying homes because of the pandemic. So now you're dealing with a situation where the prices of homes have gone really high. So it's what we would call a seller's market. Was that Joe Biden's fault? Did he have an inflation, button in the White House that he was, gleefully, punching? No. These are forces largely outside the control of any given president. When Donald Trump says he's going to reduce, inflation, first of all, inflation has already gone down quite a bit if you check the price of gas and other kind of essential goods. So, okay, good luck with that. But again, a lot of the stuff that's going on is stuff that has to do with monetary policy. With the Fed, ironically, raising interest rates because we had been below water on interest rates for so long due to a series of problems that had occurred, over the course of the 21st century. So they felt like they had to raise interest rates. And that, again, ironically, had the effect of raising home prices. So how do you get a job in the federal government? I actually went through this process briefly before I got my job here at Rogers State University. I'd been out on the market for a while. I felt like I needed some kind of long-term employment, so I began the process of I had a PhD. I thought maybe I could do something, within the federal government. So where do you go to look for, a federal job? Well, there's a website. You can look around and see, is there something that fits my skill set? Second, can you find a job outside of Washington, D.C.? In fact, close to 80% of all federal jobs are here in the States. Okay, so you can live and work. I was actually looking at agencies in South Carolina at the time. How can you tell if you're qualified? You have a process that you go through. You read job announcements, you focus on critical information like duties and qualifications, how to apply, how you'll be evaluated, things like that. Fourth, what should I include on my resume? You want to show your skill sets, right? I had a PhD in political science. I had a master's degree in international relations. That could have been attractive to any number of federal agencies. Will I have to take a civil service exam? In some instances, yeah. Okay. You will, but in many lower qualification jobs, no, you wouldn't. And 6, can I apply for more than one position? Yes, you can. You can apply for as many positions as you want. Okay. Promoting citizen well-being. There are lots of agencies that are responsible for maintaining health. This is something that goes, again, all the way back to the Washington administration, because we did have, pandemics even in the 18th century. So you have the Department of Health and Human Services, which includes the National Institutes of Health, and the Centers for Disease Control. Both of these were high-profile agencies during the pandemic because their mission statement is to track diseases and to combat diseases. Okay? There are rumors that Donald Trump is going to appoint Robert Kennedy, who is a vaccine skeptic, as DHS secretary. I think that would probably not be a great decision, but that's up to the president. He gets to make those decisions. It's interesting that the Department of Agriculture, they have food and nutrition services programs that basically manage school lunch. If you got a free school lunch when you were a kid, that was a federal agency that did that. Likewise, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, again ensures that this country doesn't have large numbers of children who are suffering from malnutrition. Malnutrition is a scourge of developing countries' populations. When you allow a child to become chronically malnourished, that child is far more likely to become basically a ward of the state. They are far more likely to develop mental and physical deficiencies that will prevent them over the course of their working life from being an effective citizen and an effective worker. Likewise, you have the Department of the Interior. They manage federal lands. Okay, that's their job. There's vast swaths of the western United States that are basically federal lands. Why were they made federal lands? Because you want to control population influxes into many of those places. Now, a lot of western states are mad about that, but the reality is there is simply not enough water to manage large numbers of people moving into what are effectively desert states. Okay? You can't have, for example, Las Vegas without the Hoover Dam that makes Lake Mead possible. Okay? And Lake Mead is down. And so Las Vegas is having a problem managing its water supply. That is becoming a significant issue. Leadership. Congress can designate whether a bureaucratic agency will be headed by a single person or a multi-person board. Now, multi-person boards have one particular advantage. That means you can create sort of a bipartisan structure to it. Okay? So, for example, for the as an example, the Securities and Exchange Commission can only have 3 of its 5 members from the same party. The other party gets a selection if there is an opening, and the majority party already has 3 commissioners. That still enables them to act in the majority. Now, one of the challenges that's been coming along is that Republicans have increasingly been acting in bad faith. For example, the Federal Elections Commission is supposed to be bipartisan. Republicans have been appointing FEC commissioners who simply refuse. They deadlock the committees on issues regarding violations of federal election law, which effectively mean that federal election law is unenforceable. And that has enabled Republicans to historically violate federal election rules. Okay. You also have with the Federal Reserve, one of the ways that you can enhance the independence of an agency, and the Federal Reserve is one of those agencies you really don't want to become politicized. Federal Reserve people serve, I believe, 15-year terms. The chair of the Federal Reserve their terms of service are designed to expire outside of a presidential election year. Now, I mentioned the Federal Reserve for a very important reason. Donald Trump has again said during the presidential campaign that he wanted a final say over Fed policy. That is a bad idea. Politicizing the Fed, the last time that happened was with Richard Nixon, and the result was hyperinflation, stagflation, and a really bad economy. Okay, so I mention this just again to say that, if you voted for Donald Trump, that is your right. You have your right to vote for whomever you want. But be careful what you ask for. Donald Trump is going to do some things that if you're paying attention, you're going to realize are probably not good for you. So again, I offer you the earnest advice that you need to be paying attention to what's happening around you. And on that happy note, I will close this particular lecture. When we come back, we're going to continue talking about the role of the bureaucracy, the challenges they face in, basically governing in such a polarized environment. I'll see you next time.